so much for being here. And we can close our books for a few moments. Zachary and Eva, can you hear me up there? Zachary, Eva? Yes, excellent. Okay. Thank you. There's a famous story about two brothers who each inherited half of their father's family farm. One was married and had many children, and the other was single. They each lived on two halves of the farm. There was a hill right in the middle. And when the harvest time came, the single brother said, you know, my married brother, he's got a whole family, he's got many mouths to feed. He needs much more of this harvest than I do. So I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night, I'm going to sneak over there, and I'm going to put half of my pile on his. Same time, the single brother thinks to himself, you know, or rather, the married brother thinks to himself, my single brother, he's alone, he has no one to care for, no one to love him. As he ages, he's going to have no children to take care of him. All he has is his business. I'm going to take half of my pile of wheat, and I'm going to put it on his pile. And so they wake up the next morning, and sure enough, their piles are exactly the same size. Next night, same thing happens. The married brother brings half his pile over the single brother's pile, and the single brother brings half of his pile over the married brother's pile. They wake up, and once again, the piles of wheat are exactly the same size. Third night comes. They wake up once again, they take their piles, only this time they run into each other in the middle of the hill. They realize exactly what's happening, and they embrace. And the story goes that this was the hill that was chosen by God where the temple in Jerusalem would be built. Similar story, same beginning. Two brothers each inherit half of their father's farm. One is married with many children, one is single. There's a hill in the middle. Each one lives on half of the farm. When harvest time comes, the married brother says, you know, my single brother, he has no mouths to feed. I've got an entire family. I'm going to wake up in the middle of the night. I'm going to sneak out. I'm going to take half of his pile. Meanwhile, the single brother says, you know, my married brother, what does he need this harvest for? He's got a content life, a happy wife, children. All I have is my business. I need it more than he does. I'm going to sneak over in the middle of the night, and I'm going to take half his pile. So he does that, and they wake up the next morning, and sure enough, their piles are exactly the same size. Same thing happens the second night. Third night, they try it one more time, only this time, they run into each other in the middle of the hill. They realize what's happening, and they begin a fist fight. And the story goes, this was the hill where they chose to build the Israeli Knesset. Never gets old for me, that one. So continuing the theme that we began on Rosh Hashanah, tonight I'm going to be talking about the Israel you expected me to talk about, which is the land and the state of Israel. And I can tell you it felt like both of those hills at different times. Earlier, obviously on Rosh Hashanah, we talked about broader themes, but I think it's important to talk about the state as well. But I'm mostly going to talk about my experiences there over my sabbatical, 4 months living in Jerusalem, although you can't quite help but stay away from at least the current event portion. We're going to cover that too. So whenever I'm asked, or whenever any of you ask, you take a trip to Israel and somebody says, how was your trip? And you kind of don't know how to respond. This is not like going to Vegas or Hawaii or something. There's so much more to it. So I usually say it was great. But what I want to say is that it was incredibly spiritual, but it was also shockingly normal. And of course, it was also contentious and complicated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about all three tonight. Let's start with the incredibly spiritual. A story that illustrates this from our first day there. We arrived in Jerusalem, and we had an awful lot to do because we had an apartment. It wasn't, an Airbnb or hotel. Passover was coming soon, so we had to shop. We needed to go to the hardware store. We needed to go to various home goods stores. We needed to get groceries. I wanted to go to my favorite shawarma place. Karen wanted rubella from marzipan. So that led us to Machane Ben Yehuda, where we got more fruits and vegetables, and I wanted to compare the new place to the old place and see how far it was going to be from the ulpans we might go to and various things. And we did it all. We arrived home at 4 o'clock. We're appropriately exhausted. And then I realized, I haven't been to the Western Wall yet. I always go to the Western Wall on my first day. I need to soak up the spirituality of the old stones. But my feet are killing me. I'm so tired. And it's pouring rain. Do I really want to go? But of course, I force myself to go, and I take the 40-minute or so walk from our house in deep Rehavia to the Western Wall in the pouring rain. I arrive at the plaza, and it's practically empty. It's not quite Passover or tourist season yet, and it's pouring rain, so nobody's there. I go to the wall. I say some prayers, I turn around to walk back, and I bump into a very large black man. And I look up, and he looks down, and like the brothers on the hill, we embrace. It's my good friend, Pastor Dumasani Washington, founder of IBSI, the Institute for Black Solidarity with Israel. He has spoken from this bema before. Now, it's not at all unusual to run into someone you know in Jerusalem, particularly at the Western Wall. But the fact that at this moment, when I almost didn't go, turned out he almost didn't go, it's pouring rain, the rabbi and the minister together, practically alone on the plaza of the Western Wall, it just felt like one of those incredibly spiritual moments. So too did many others, including taking many, many visitors. If you followed my blog, you saw it seemed like every couple days there was someone from the congregation, some old friend, some kid on their birthright trip that may have grown up here or grown up with Dre Lazier and Open GBG. And I was showing them the wall, I was showing them other parts of Jerusalem, the congregational trip, over 40 members and staff, seeing the holiness of Israel through their first-time eyes. Just so many of these incredible moments. Incredibly spiritual indeed. But it's not all eating amazing kosher food and drinking sunlight all day long. Israel is also a very normal place. Despite what you read, despite all that spirituality, despite the terrorism, all the things you read, all the difficulties, the challenges, the divisiveness, it's a place where people still do their laundry, right? And they get groceries. And they go to work, and they drop off their children places, and they take public transportation, and they wait in interminably long lines, and they deal with a really difficult bureaucracy. Except that they do it with a little more happiness. And I say that, don't just trust me. The recent rankings, there is such a thing as a happiness index of the nations of the world, and within the last couple weeks it changed again. Israel is the 4th happiest nation on the planet. Okay, Finland's number 1, but Israel is number 4. People are happy there. And you can tell, because the place is jumping. I mean, it's just alive. People are out all night long at the bars, the cafes, the restaurants, just having a good time, living normal, but very happy lives. So it's incredibly spiritual. It's shockingly normal. And if I didn't have to talk about the third thing, this would be a relatively short sermon. But Israel is also complicated and contentious. I've never seen it more divided than it is right now. And I know you're reading about that too. It felt like the other two brothers on the hill at certain times. And I feel like I have to at least discuss what exactly it is they are fighting about and why you're seeing thousands, hundreds of thousands of protesters in the street. Except that I might not be doing what you expect me to do, because I'm actually, if you've listened to any other sermons, they're basically rabbis telling their congregants democracy is about to die and you got to get it out there in the streets. And I'm not sure they're wrong, but I also feel that it's my duty to explain that there are actually multiple sides to the issue, and that it is actually much more complicated than what we read, or what, let's be honest, most of our friends tell us. So I'm going to reveal my biases for sure, but I'm going to do it in a way that really tries to get at the complexity. So what they're fighting about is judicial reform. But before I explain what judicial reform is, I have to give a little teeny primer about some assumptions about how the Israeli government works in general, and this particular government works as well. So we have to start off with the fact that there are not three branches. There's only two. There's the legislative branch, the Knesset, and there is the judicial branch, the judges. I know there's a prime minister, and we perceive him as very powerful, but he is essentially the same as the Knesset. He's just the leader of the ruling coalition. So the only check and balance there is the court on the Knesset. That's the first thing you have to know. Second thing you need to know is there is no constitution in Israel to fall back upon. There's only a Declaration of Independence and what are called basic laws. Third thing you have to know, Israel has elected the most right-wing government in its history. You may already know that. And it includes parties which never would have been allowed in the coalition before, in any coalition. They have leaders who are extremist and dangerous, and they're not just in the government, many of them have leadership positions. So you need to know that too. Now the fourth thing, the part that may make it most confusing, especially as I talk about it, is that the right-wing coalition, they are pro-judicial reform. The center-left opposition, they are anti-reform and pro-status quo. And I know that's not what we usually think of when we're talking about reform. Right-wing pro-reform, left-wing anti. So now, what does this mean? Two things, mostly. And I'm way oversimplifying it, but it's the only way we can make it clear. The first thing is the ruling parties want that the Knesset should have the ability to vote on any law they want by a simple majority and have no interference, no possibility of overrule by the courts, thus removing the only check and balance that exists. Second thing that they want is they want the power to appoint judges. Right now, judges basically appoint themselves. They appoint the next judges, and they tend to be of a certain center and center-left ilk, which is also how what I would pick at a judge, but that's not what the ruling coalition would pick at a judge. So the ruling coalition says we need reform because democracy, majority should rule, and the judges are not even elected, they're appointed. So on the one hand, you can sort of see the argument. Why then are hundreds of thousands of people in the streets? Because, well, it starts with the fact that this is the most right-wing coalition in Israel's history, and they fear what will happen. First of all, it removes the only check and balance that we have, right? That can be dangerous in and of itself. Secondly, although majority rules is true democracy, it can be very dangerous for minorities. And in particular, in this case, the concern is for, all minorities, but especially women, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, and a whole bunch of other folks as well, who the right wing may leave out of the equation. People are also concerned about religious coercion. They're also concerned about the long-term effect that this will have on the democratic nature of the state. So for all those reasons, and did I mention, this is the most right-wing government in Israel's history, they're worried about where they want to go with all this, right? And so that's why thousands, hundreds of thousands of people are protesting in the streets. And I went to some of those protests. I support those protests. I identify with most of the people doing most of the protests. It's more complicated than that, which is why I just said what I said. Because I, like many of you, we tend to know two types of Israelis. Now forgive me, you and God, because I'm about to completely overgeneralize, all right? Very, very much so. But most of us in this room tend to know either secular left Israelis, tech people, expats who have moved here, or we know people who have moved to Israel from here, and we grew up with them. They went to Camp Ramah, they went to Camp Newman, whatever. They maybe are involved in religious life there, but it's liberal Jewish life, it's Reformed, conservative, or very modern Orthodox synagogues. We know them, we identify with them, we kind of are them. Most of us also know people who are very right-wing and very religious, ultra-religious. They might be our cousins, brothers and sisters. They might be people we also went to school with, but who came Balei Tshuva. And they're pro-reform, and we very much don't identify with them. We think they are very different from us. And so we can't imagine wanting what they want. But you see, that's not all there is in Israel. Okay? There are a whole bunch of other Israelis, and again, I'm overgeneralizing here too. It's hard to meet them unless you already know them, or if you go on a cruise right before you go to Israel, and there's a bunch of Israelis on it. And these Israelis tend to be more middle class. They're more often than not Mizrahi and not Ashkenazi. They have Middle Eastern heritage. And in their view, they support reform. They kind of think it's not as big of a deal as you think it is. And the courts have been overreaching for decades. And the courts are Ashkenazic elitists, and they don't represent us. And so, therefore, we also support the reform. And what you read, it's all American leftist publications. So, this type of Israeli exists as well. And though that is not my view, I do feel it is my duty to explain that it is a view that it exists and is not as simple as we think it is. Now, either way, I'm really concerned. I'm really worried. I'm absolutely concerned about the long-term effect on the democratic nature of the state. I'm concerned about the trampling of minority rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrants' rights there. I'm concerned about religious coercion. And I'm also concerned about a potential brain drain that Israel's best and brightest in tech, in medicine, in academia, in finance, they're all going to leave because they're talking about it, and some of them already are. And yet, I'm more optimistic than the average article you are going to read in the Jewish press. Or maybe less pessimistic would be a better way of putting it. And here's why. Two reasons. Number one, the protests are kind of working. The ruling coalition, they've had a pretty firm majority this whole time, and very little has been passed, and everything seems to be being watered down, and even Prime Minister Netanyahu wants compromise, so do a lot of people, but not the right, the very right or the very left. And so I think it's going to happen. Otherwise, the most draconian reforms would have happened already. I really believe that. And the other reason I believe that is Israel has not yet given up on unity. The Israeli flag, everybody's waving it. It's the symbol of the right, it's the symbol of the left. You pass a group of protesters, unless you hear them speaking, and your Hebrew's better than mine, you don't know whether they're pro-reform or anti-reform. Everybody cares about their country, loves the country, and wants to own the flag. And as a further example of this, last week, second last week, whatever it was, we were on our way back from a visit to Tel Aviv, and there was the Tel Avivans were heading to an anti-reform protest in Jerusalem. the Jerusalemites were heading to a pro-reform protest in Tel Aviv. They're kind of switching roles. I did not say that incorrectly, that's what was happening. And we're in the train station, and one side is going down the escalator, one side's going up the escalator, and they're literally high-fiving one another. Okay, it is a true story. They have not given up on keeping the country together. One more final story. Some of you read this story on my blog. If you came the first week that I came back, I told it in synagogue, but it bears repeating. And for what I just said and for this story, you'll see why I believe that all hope is not yet lost. So now, at the end of the trip, it's the final Sunday. I'm leaving that night at like midnight. And in my infinite wisdom, I agreed to help a friend officiate at his son's bar mitzvah on my last day. So Josh Labarsky's bar mitzvah is going to be Sunday morning, 10:30, 11, whatever it is. And they wanted it at the Western Wall, but at the egalitarian section of the Western Wall, the Robinson's Arch, the plaza, where men and women are allowed to pray together. So I said to them in advance, you need to book the place, right? You can't just show up. And so they did. They paid. They reserved it. And a couple months before, I thought, I don't really know how do I get access to the Torah and the prayer books that are there. So I called the Masorti movement, the conservative movement, which runs the site, for which our synagogue and me personally as a rabbinical assembly member pay lots of money to. And I called them up and I say, how do I access the Torah and the prayer books? And they said, what's the date? I told them, they said, oh, that's a Sunday. We only help if it's Mondays or Thursdays. And I said, well, how do I get access to the Torah that's right there? You can't. Best of luck. And I'm not exaggerating. That's pretty much how the conversation went. So thus begins this wild goose chase. I need a Torah. After about 6 or 7 rejections from various institutions, finally one synagogue, Mayanot, Kehilat Mayanot, about an hour's walk, way down there in Arnona, an hour's walk from the site, says you can rent a Torah. And so I found my Torah, thanks to them, and I show up that morning. It's 8:30 in the morning. I'm there to get the Torah. And a normal person would have taken the Torah, gotten in a taxi, and then taken the taxi to about 5-6 minute walk from the site. But I can be a little bit of a martyr sometimes. And after all I've been through, there's no way I'm paying any more money to get in a taxi cab. Plus, I've been averaging 21,000 steps a day. I can do it. So I bring a duffel bag to carry the Torah. And of course, the Torah doesn't fit in the duffel bag. And I feel like I can't just walk in the streets of Jerusalem with a Torah. It feels dangerous and just wrong. And so I take the only thing I can to cover it, which is those giant black plastic garbage bags. So something like this, bigger Torah though. It's about 93 degrees. You ever walked for an hour with a heavy object in a black plastic bag pressed against your chest? Well, I have. So I'm walking, I'm sweating profusely. And then something really cool happens. So it turns out that a black plastic bag is not a very good disguise for the Torah. Okay, so people know what I'm doing. And I'm walking, and it's as if there's a Torah cam on the Torah. And it's observing all the people. Because people from all walks of life are coming up to the Torah. And they're touching it, they're kissing it. I mean, moms with babies in strollers. Right? People in business casual on their way to work. Tourists with long khaki shorts. A little group of yeshiva buchers, 5- and 6-year-olds with payas. Senior citizens just getting out of their exercise class. Everybody's coming up, they're walking to it, they're kissing the Torah. And at a certain point, I can't tell. Am I carrying the Torah? Or is the Torah carrying me? So I finally arrive in the old city. I'm like an hour before the bar mitzvah. And I have to go to the bathroom really bad. Okay, so what do you do with the Torah if you have to go to the bathroom? Now, I can't bring it to the site and leave it there because it's going to be unattended. Obviously, I'm not taking it to the bathroom with me. And so I'm thinking, how about the halva shop? Okay, there's a halva shop where I've been a bunch of times. I sent half the trip there to buy halva. So I go in there, I'm sweating profusely, I'm panting. I'm like, can you guys do me the biggest favor? I'm like, you want us to hold the Sefer Torah? And I said, please. So I put the Torah down, hands it in, puts it down on the counter. I go to the bathroom. I come back, I've cooled off. And there's a debate going on about whether you can have a Torah in a halva shop and whether you can cover it with a black plastic bag. But I take the Torah from the table. They see that there's actually a talit and a Torah cover, and everyone was fine. I head down to Robinson's Arch. The bar mitzvah goes off without a hitch. Joshua Levarsky becomes bar mitzvah. But what I realized, or was reminded of, in that walk that never should have had to happen, was that it doesn't really matter ultimately what age we are, whether we're pro-reform or anti-reform, orthodox or secular. Everybody still in Israel wants to kiss the Torah. And so there is hope for sure. Gemar Chatima Tova. I did take a taxi back. We continue with the LA. Please rise, page 246.